Hello, hello, hello. Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Okay, testing, testing. Can anybody hear me?
Yes, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Ward. How are you?
I am well. How are you?
What can I say? Another Thursday already. Amazing. All right. Well, we're in our final session today. I don't know where the time goes. I see you guys have a few more sessions left to go before final examinations and all that. So you're not out of the woods yet, unfortunately. All right, let's see who's with us so far. Shanika. Not yet. Shakira.
Good evening.
Good evening, Shakira. Did I tell you that when you put all your names together, it looks like a foreign language?
Yeah, you said Russian.
Russian in particular. How ironic. Putin, the most recent madman to show up.
Exactly.
Interesting, they said Donald Trump was the madman, but during his time, nobody caused any problems.
No, there was no war.
Nor did he go out and start any wars.
Nope.
But he was deemed to be the madman. How ironic is that? I guess like John the Baptist, I suppose. Interesting.
Yes.
All right. Letitia. On the way. Okay. Sandy. On the way. Okay. Ernst.
Good evening.
Good evening, Ernst. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Wonderful, wonderful. May as well, because you have a whole life ahead of you, lots of things to do. So it's just as well. Okay. Danica.
Good day.
How are you?
Good.
Wonderful. Is there any risk involved working at that bank?
Every day.
Every day. Yes, indeed. And as long as you feel that way, that's good for you. Keeps you alert.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't change that everyday thing. That's good. Okay, Nikita. Okay. I know Maud is here. She shouted at the beginning. Okay. Katura. On the way. Now, let's see. Is that Kayleen? I think I saw that come up in the chat a minute ago.
Yes. Kayleen, yes. Good evening, everyone. Good evening.
Good evening, Kayleen. Welcome aboard. This is your first session with this gang, I imagine. The Risk Gang.
Yes, it is.
Okay, well, Bill,
Unfortunately, I had health emergency with my mom, so
yeah, first things first, for sure. But welcome aboard. We're glad to have you nevertheless.
thank
I'm
you.
sure you were following up with your reading, etc. So you just missed all the crazy stuff we had to say along the way. But happy to have you and catch the tail end of whatever's coming. I'm not sure either. We're not even sure what we're going to say next sometimes. So just hang on, see what's going on.
Thank
Okay,
you.
welcome. Tema. Tema is busy trying to duck one of those half brothers. All right. Guess the others will join us shortly if they're going to be here today. Welcome back to our last session of risk management. I hope everybody's had an opportunity to look at this Smith case and jot down a few points. Whenever we get to that this evening, there'll be no right and wrong answers. We'll just be throwing stuff out to see if there are any risk issues in the case. If there are, what are they potentially? What kinds of threats and opportunities the risk issues present, and so on. Remember, while we usually discuss risk in a negative way, there is some positive risk that we can take, oftentimes referred to as calculated risk, and nothing's wrong with a calculated risk. In fact, part of mitigating risk sometimes is about taking a calculated risk to mitigate an even greater risk. So that is not unusual, nor unheard of, nor should it be removed from your thought processes when you're thinking about risk mitigation, for sure. All right. So, but first things first, I have one or two other excerpts. If we have time, I'll have persons read a couple of the excerpts pertaining to risk management in the real world and another world um, that I thought was quite interesting in terms of how they actually try to apply this stuff for real. For some organizations, risk management is still a pipe dream. They don't really practice it as they should in terms of planning and looking down the road strategically and really trying to get rid of risk for real. Some companies are still putting out fires all the time because they refuse to sit down and plan and document the risk issues. Okay? They're still having fights with regulatory people who keep trying to get them to sit down to come up with the risk problems and writing them down. Companies are still copying and pasting risk from other places on the internet as opposed to dealing with their own real risk. And interesting enough, some companies are not doing the whole risk thing because they don't really want to reveal what their risks are. And I think regulators, to some extent, might be aware of this, and they are not happy about it. So every time you turn around, there is some other twist to the issue of risk. Kaylin, just for your information, these classes are very interactive. If you want to raise a question, make a point, give an example, say anything you feel like, talk about the war in Ukraine, whatever it is you want to say, feel free to do that. You don't have to put your hand up. You don't have to wait until the end of class. None of that stuff. You can just interrupt me and let it rip. Okay?
Okay, thank you for saying that.
All right, so we're all the way down to slide number 29 already. Hopefully we'll get to the rest of them. But the rest of them are not so complex anymore. They just kind of bring some things into focus. And then we tie them into all the other wild and crazy risk issues we talked about earlier in terms of identifying risk, assessing it, taking steps to resolve them, the board taking responsibility from the top, following through, making sure that things go according to plan, senior management executing. Those are the kinds of things we're talking about. And the one or two excerpts that I've pulled out as additional discussion points will show the importance of actually sitting down and articulating and then documenting risk issues. It would be great if some firms would really start to give it serious consideration. They'll discover that their lives would be much more predictable. Their regulatory inspections would be far more palatable. And for some countries around the world, the fines that they get from regulators would be considerably less, if only they would. So slide number 29, then, that's where we pick it up today. Begins with the issue of internal controls being a risk mitigator. And the reason why that is so is because if you have internal controls in place, then potential problems are immediately reduced. If two people are signing checks instead of one, you can see the risk level goes down significantly. If two people are counting cash that comes into the overnight machine or the ATM, it reduces the risk significantly as opposed to just one person. If people's jobs are segregated, it reduces. These are all internal control issues. If documents are properly authorized by independent parties at different levels in the organization, these, again, are internal controls that tend to keep risk down. Any organization that violates any of these rules under the internal control function have lived to regret it, and many continue to suffer because their controls are weak. Okay, so it is definitely something to be looking at. Some companies have controls in place to mitigate risk, but they allow them to become slack, so to speak. They don't enforce the rules. People get too comfortable. People get too chummy. People get too something. and then we start not following through with the internal control procedures as we should. And usually when that happens, people who are up to no good, for example, in the firm, tend to use that as an opportunity to get away with something. Theft, embezzlement, money laundering, whatever the case might be. Okay? So back to risk and risk management again. Every week we come in, we see a different definition of risk and risk management. And that is because it has so many different bases, so many different issues that come up as risk. And so the more we are aware of the different kinds of notations, the more we can recognize these things when they show or rear the ugly heads. Okay? So now at this juncture, along with all the other risk definitions we've had, we have another twist to risk. And we're saying here that it's the possibility of an adverse event. Okay, no doubt, something negative, something dark, something stinky that can cause the organization to falter and oftentimes not achieve its objectives. Very common problem. And so again, now that we twist the risk, we have to twist the risk management process. And so we add some extra components like it's important to increase confidence within the organization. It's important to prioritize within the organization. It's important to seek all possible means to overcome the obstacles. And everybody has to be on board. It's not just the board of directors or senior management or middle management or any particular sector. Everybody needs to be on board. Because remember, when it comes to risk, you're only as strong as your weakest link. Please remember that. No matter what you have in place, you don't get it down to the person who needs to know, then they become the weakest link. And they're the ones, or one, who will create the problems for the organization. Oftentimes, all because the information never got to them. The training never got to them. The details never got to them, whatever the case might be. It has to filter all the way down. Or else someone is going to put a chink in the machine. Then everybody is scrambling to figure out what the hell happened. So what is internal control? Well, we already talked about that to some extent. I just threw in that nice little formal definition there, just to kind of consolidate the issue of internal control. But primarily, it is initiated by the company's board and its management, and it's designed for everybody to be involved in regards to making sure that the organization's plans are properly executed with the minimum amount of risk, pain, and suffering. And so whenever we discuss internal controls, we discuss things like efficiency and effectiveness, those two words. And oftentimes when we talk about efficiency and effectiveness, we don't really define them. And we shouldn't try to define them generically. They just give us the starting blocks for what we really should be doing. Every organization's effectiveness and efficiency in its operation is different. So it's very difficult to give a generic definition. Every organization has to sit down and say, what makes us effective? How do we get things done? And what makes us efficient? Do we get it done with the least amount of resources without hurting the organization as a whole? Okay. The other internal control issue that organizations have to always be thinking about is the issue of reliable financial reporting. Now, I don't know if you guys have been, or if you're familiar with what is purported to be the reporting situation in places like China and other countries that are very quiet about what they do. The question of whether they use GAAP and what principles they use and whether they're consistent and whether their audits are done the way they're done in the West. Well, those things are always sketchy for countries like China and Africa and other parts of the Middle East and the whole depending on the country. But the point is, if you're going to effectively manage your risk, it is very crucial not only to make sure that your operations are being run according to plan, but that the financial reporting is reliable. Anybody who's been watching anything in the last 5 to 10 years, you would know that there have been a whole lot of fines and reputation risk and people going to prison and all kinds of issues because of poor and unreliable and sometimes illegal and immoral financial reporting. Okay. Companies have been cooking the books and putting in numbers for sales that does not exist and calling expenses assets and all kinds of crazy stuff. These are absolute no-nos. Okay. Remember, any organization can report financial information, but the question is it reliable? Is it based on things that have actually happened? Can you provide documentation to support what is in your general ledger? Because what is in your general ledger will come out eventually as financial reporting. So if the general ledger has garbage in it, and so will your financial reporting. This is not uncommon. Many companies still suffer for some reason, either on purpose or not, from unreliable financial reporting, a major, major risk and a major, major internal control dysfunction, unfortunately. Considering how sophisticated auditing and accounting practices have become, you would think that we'd be past this, but it's not really the auditing and the practice that's the problem. It's the evil that men do that creates unreliable anything, including financial reporting. Most of our problems, I keep telling persons in my sessions, in my seminars, whatever the case might be, the problem is with organizations and countries, etc., is not incompetence. It's rather illegal activity, unethical activity. People are always up to stuff that they should not be doing. And therefore, it results in major, major risk issues, unfortunately. And then, of course, the other internal control issue is compliance, which, of course, is everybody's conversation in the modern world. Are you compliant? Are you compliant? Are you compliant? And the belief is the more you conform to compliance requirements, the less risk issues you have to deal with. And unfortunately, for those of us who don't believe that, that is true. Okay? For sure. Again, some examples of risk mitigates under internal controls. Mentioned it earlier, double signatures in some companies might be triple signatures, depending on the size of the company and the type of the transactions. The other thing is contingency planning. A lot of people don't like to plan for what may happen, but organizations would do well to have some kind of contingency planning in their internal control process, because unexpected things happen. And depending on the type of business you do, it cannot hurt to have a contingency plan in place in order to mitigate your risk. Cannot. Policies and procedures. What can I say? Companies continue to get fined millions of dollars for not writing down their policies and procedures correctly, sufficiently, and unique to their organization. And regulators go in on even more than one occasion. Write them up, tell them when we come back, make sure it's fixed, else we're going to fine you. And a year or two later, they go back and they still haven't done it, or it's still not sufficient or complete. And so they get fined again. The risk with this kind of thing is sooner or later you might eventually start pissing regulators off. And if you're not careful, the fines are going to get greater, and they might start even to threaten your very existence by asking you questions about your banking license or your financial services license, or whatever the case might be, in an effort to get you to conform. After all, oftentimes when companies take risks, they're not the only ones affected. Okay? That's the problem. If something goes wrong in a particular financial institution, for example, depending on what it is, it can create a countrywide risk called reputation risk. And so if something untoward happens in the Bahamas at a particular financial institution and it gets out into the world, they're going to say, oh, yeah, those guys again. We always knew they were a bunch of whatever it was, money launderers or non-compliance people or anti-FATF people or whatever the case might be. And of course, we don't need any of that stuff. We have enough problems with the OECD and FATF as it is. And they keep looking at us to see if we'll make a mistake, I guess. Okay. So this stuff is not only good for your firm, this risk management mitigation thing, all these different categories that we look at, but rather it's good for the country as well. Okay. It only takes one firm to do the wrong thing, and before you know it, we're all in the middle of a big old doggone European mess called OECD and FATF. Gray list, black list, blue list, purple lists, and all this crazy stuff. In fact, there's some countries around the world that still have the audacity to call the Bahamas a tax haven still, despite all our efforts. For some countries, we have not been able to get them to swallow that word, which of course no longer applies to the Bahamas. But some folks continue to hang on to it. And that's how fragile reputational issues are. Okay? All right. So if you guys look at this matrix then, you'll see it's broken down into 4 risk categories. In case you are interested in looking at some issues to take back to your work area, your environment, your whatever the case might be. These are some of the key ones. I'm sure there are others, but these 4 in this quadrant tends to show its ugly head all too often. Okay. For example, if you look at operational risk, we have all the common problems like bidding issues and the transfer of information and problems with construction and problems with the accounting process and auditors not auditing sufficiently and properly and providing inaccurate audit reports for whatever reason, construction persons overcharging and padding construction contracts. All these are all operational risk issues that illegal bidding processes, people getting inside information. Man, all of these kinds of risks create problems once they're discovered. But it doesn't seem as if discovery bothers everyone. And so you have to always be aware, depending on what part of these things affect your particular organization, your particular workspace. And be prepared if you see risk issues around you to mention it to the appropriate people. Because you might end up, at the end of the day, helping your organization by reporting potential risks that you might observe as you go from day to day. Cannot hurt to do that. Okay. Financial risks include things like market risk, manipulation of securities in the market, capital risks, all the shortcuts sometimes that persons take to raise money. The cost of capital is the cost of borrowing, which is affected by illegal trading in the market, misinformation, and all this kind of crazy stuff. Creates all kind, and we operate every day in this environment. Maybe some of us not directly, because you are in maybe perhaps middle management, some area, other area of the firm that you don't feel these things happening. But I can assure you, somewhere within your organization, these things are happening. Okay? If not at the bottom, in the middle, if not in the middle, at the top. If not at the top, throughout the organization. So again, it depends on where you are. Let's not forget strategic risk, long-term planning. We don't like that. But strategic risk means sitting down and asking hard questions about Who is our competition? Why are they our competition? How long can we expect them to be our competition? What do we have to do to make sure they are not our competition anymore? How can we outcompete them? How can we keep them from getting information on what we do so that they could move ahead of us? These are all strategic risk issues just on the competition alone. And as you can see, these kinds of questions are very core questions. That's only competition. That's not even the other areas. Okay, like what's going on in the industry. Phones have cameras on them. Should we stay in the camera business much longer? How much longer will people be buying special cameras? When will phones be getting special camera features so you won't need the other cameras that are in the store? Point is, and these are, again, industry changes. How can we grow? Why are we stagnant? Why do we have too many people? Do we need all these staff members? Are we getting any benefit from what we have? Again, these are strategic risk questions. Those firms who ask them and toil with them tend to do better than those firms who don't. And last but not least in this quadrant is what we call hazard risk. And people are like, what is hazard risk? Well, hazard risk is real. Like an earthquake hazard risk with no BCP in place, or an inadequate BCP in place. That can be pretty hazardous. Loss of all client information. You can't find it because you don't have it properly stored in the proper place, off site, off country if necessary. Hazard risk. Injury to staff. It's always a problem. People can sue. They're going to be away from work for long periods of time. When they come back, you can't fire them because they were injured, and so on. Illnesses, theft, and oh my God, talk about theft. Always a hazard risk. Because people are looking to steal assets from companies all the time, from cash all the way down to toilet paper, pens, pencils, we don't really care. Again, when companies start looking at these in broad terms, they can discover that they can be very costly at the end of the day. And so again, these things must all be looked at. So who has time to go through all this nonsense? Somebody needs to have the time. If we're not looking at them, sooner or later, those things in some form or another are going to come back to haunt your firm. Now, some firms are so big that they can be haunted and still survive. Other firms are not so big. So when they're haunted, they suffer greatly. And then other firms are not big enough. So when they're haunted, they go out of business. Most times we don't even know the rest of the world, nor does it care. But I can assure you, oftentimes when that happens, because they're not looking at any of these issues, thinking that in fact, it doesn't even apply to them. Or they don't want to spend the resources to have somebody come in and do an assessment. Or they don't want to hear what the assessment is. Or they really don't think they have a problem at all. Okay? Very interesting. To think you don't have a problem at all is a major risk. To not have somebody come in and look at your situation if you're a small entity is another major risk. And if you think you're too big to fail, that may be so in some instances. But the losses can be significant, the reputation damage can be significant, and every now and then the Titanic goes under. Don't believe me? Check out WorldCom and such companies. And you'll see that they went under. Huge, huge multi-billion-dollar companies. Enron, WorldCom, and company thought they were too big to fail. See that? They didn't, man, we don't have to deal with these quadrants issues. It's all academic. It's just for students trying to study risk. We are sophisticated and well-trained board members. We can spot anything at a moment's notice. We don't need to plan. We just feel it. It's not good. Okay? Many of them have actually come back to regret. All right. So having said that, then, with regards to these internal control issues, And again, these are things that are generally occurring with inside the firm. So you always should have persons designated to check the environment, control environment. There should be persons designated to check the risk issues and make assessments to find out what the control activities are in your firm. Can't have everybody doing it, but there should be a risk management department, a risk management person, somebody or some bodies who's out there looking at these things on a day-to-day basis and making the necessary reports to the board so that mitigation issues can be put in place and monitored. Okay, see, monitored. That's the other thing. Other times we put risk mitigating issues in place, we don't check it afterwards. It's like when people get married, everybody's excited until they get married, and after that, no more monitoring. Nobody's checking anymore. So the wife goes one place, she's busy with whatever. Tom Jones, her husband, is not busy, whatever. The children are busy with the hell ever, and everybody's off and running, and nobody's monitoring anything. The house is on autopilot. Some companies run themselves that way, like they're on autopilot. Nobody is checking, nobody is monitoring to give feedback to see what's wrong, what needs to be fixed until something explodes. And then suddenly, everybody's looking around to see who they can name. Okay. All right. Any questions so far on this crazy risk world? No questions? Am I the only one with a question? Okay. So let me see. Nikita, are you in the room yet? No. Okay. Katura, are you in the room yet? Sandy,
Hi,
is that Sandy or Katura?
this is Sandy.
Hi, Sandy, how are you?
I'm good.
Beautiful. I'm just updating my register while I listen to all the quiet in the background. I said, so far, are there any issues with questions on the risk? Nobody answered. I'm assuming that means that no major issues at the moment. All right, so welcome aboard, Sandy.
Thank you.
Do you have any risk issues in the last week?
Well, I've been home for the past 2 weeks. But I've been home for the past 2 weeks. But pardon me?
Home to be risky. Are you feeling your home that you're free from risk?
Oh, no. No. The more I stay on, the more money I spend. I run the risk of going broke.
So you notice that? Yes. It's an interesting. The longer you stay home, the more money you spend. That's an interesting situation, but it's true. Somehow that happens, Sandy. It's a strange.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're back to work now?
I'll be back on Tuesday.
I know you can't wait so you can save some money.
Yeah, I don't like being home.
All you have to do now is survive this final weekend, this final holiday weekend.
Yeah.
That requires even more money again. So,
I know.
I know. I get it. As simple as that might seem, some people believe that there's no risk in being home. There is risk in being home. The risk that you'll spend more money than you actually budgeted to spend. And that is a fact. Okay? And it might seem like a simple matter to some people, It's not an organizational wide issue, but in terms of your pocketbook, there's nothing simple about it at all. All right. Which brings me to my next point. I'm glad you raised that. Uh, uh, Everything is relative, including risk. So what one person might think is not a major risk issue for them, for somebody else, it'll kill them in one form or another. So thank you for raising that. Yeah, being home, absolutely. I know when my kids were growing up, being home was very expensive. Like when they were home for the summer, I'm like, oh my God. And I had two sons, so they ate every 15 seconds. They were hungry while they were chewing. So, so yeah, I get it completely. But hang in there, Tuesday is almost here. All right. Shanika, are you in the room yet? No. Okay. Sandy is with us. Nikita, are you in the room yet? Okay, Nikita and Katura are out taking other kinds of risks. All right. So yeah, thank you for throwing that in there. Okay. So now we're down to the elements of risk management again, another twist. And you might say, well, some of these things look familiar. They are. They're just different twists to the same problem. And yes, 6.5 a dozen are the same, but they're not always the same. Depends on who's looking at it, what the perspective is, where the 6 is sitting, where the dozen is sitting, half a dozen is sitting, and so on. So be careful. Okay? It's like looking at, let's see, Ernst, are you in the room still?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. So since I think looks like you're the only guy in the room. So yeah, you're the only guy in the room, Ernst. How about that? Is there any risk in that?
I've been getting that for all day, actually. I had a meeting, a training session from 9:30 to 1, and I was the only male in the room. So I'm getting used to it.
This is at work?
Yes, at work.
Indeed. So you're getting used to it. Okay. Is there any risk in getting used to it? I'm just a devil's advocate question now. Is there any risk in getting used to it? Yeah,
I would say this. I realize as a man, you have to kind of measure your words in a sense where, and trust me, I'm going somewhere with this, where your perspective may be where you're just emoting, you're just saying, but someone who's not a man might say, well, hey, I'm offended by what you said. So you kind of have to measure your words a bit. Because if you're talking to another man, you'd be like, okay, I'm just saying this, I'm saying with passion, but I'm not meaning any kind of weight. So I realized, at least for today, I had to kind of watch that.
Yes. Yeah. You know, I'm happy you raised it because it is a very real issue. There's no question that depending on where we are in the workplace, that the workplace is now predominantly female, which nothing wrong with that. I suspect if God didn't want females to think, he wouldn't have given them a brain. So this crazy thing about that old school stuff has to always be put in its perspective. However, sometimes if there's too much of an imbalance in the system, it creates other problems that say this kind of thing is a discussion about strategic risk. See, where is that quadrant? In case you thought that was just there for me to make you miserable. It's not there for me to make you miserable. That this discussion about this kind of issue is a strategic discussion. And it's strategic because it's going to determine and shape what the workplace is going to look like 10 years from now. And what do you want it to look like Do you want it to be a hybrid where there's a mixed and a balance of males and females working in the firm? Or do you want it to be predominantly male or predominantly female? It's an interesting thing for companies and boards to consider in terms of creating whatever their long-term plans are for the firm. Your comments about you have to measure what you say is quite understood as well, because sometimes the way you say something might be misunderstood. Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah. And obviously, because it's funny. It's funny how interesting God created men and women, how very much the same and how very different. And I'm sure he did that for a very specific reason. Have you ever wondered, Ernst, why God gave men a heavier voice generally and females a lighter voice generally? You ever wondered about that?
Actually, no, that's kind of interesting.
Mr. Wilkinson, you being trapsy, man.
Well, notice I said God. It's not me. I didn't do anything. I didn't even know I got there. All I knew, I was around calling somebody mama and dada. So it had to be him. And it's just a small curiosity among many. Isn't that fascinating? Why did he do it that way? Why did he do certain other things? So that we can create the proper balance I think he had in mind. And once you create an imbalance, things start to get really strange. So it's something for you guys to think about while you're thinking about risk mitigation. I know it doesn't seem as if something like that is part of the risk issue, but it is, because how we perceive all these things will determine how we plan or don't plan for the future of our organizations, who we hire and don't hire, and why, and what are the implications by doing that 10 years down the road. So it is a part of the quadrant. It just may not be a part of the quadrant that comes up as often as it should. Nothing personal, nothing against any particular group. It's just something to consider for sure. Okay? So yeah, I get the point when you say you have to think about it before you say it a certain way. But let me just say, if it's the right thing to say it anyway. How's that? Because it doesn't matter. Remember, the right thing is not gender specific, right, Ernst?
So what I'm learning is, and I agree, but I'm learning that it's the way you say it which speaks volumes, because I had another incident a few weeks back where I'm in sales. So time is very important for me. And I needed a response from one of my colleagues. And
before you go on,
she was taking, say it again.
Is your colleague male or female?
No, she's a female.
Okay, keep going.
So I told her, well, hey, I need a response ASAP. I really need a response. We gotta get this done. And because my energy is we gotta go.
Yeah.
She called me later and said, I hurt her feelings and all. I'm like, what are you talking about? And I had to realize that, okay, the way I said it to her, it seems if I was pushing her or I was being pushy. So I had to learn that it's a different dynamic.
Yes. It is a different dynamic. For better or for worse, it is. Which brings us to the other thing that God created, not me, nor anyone else, he. And this is the thing about our emotional makeup. Men have one type of emotional makeup. Our women have a different type of emotional makeup. Why did he do that? Why didn't he give us all the same emotional makeup? My. It's very interesting if you get less busy and stop to think about it for a moment. These seemingly very simple things, but there's nothing simple about it at all. My. So yes, you're gonna have to try and figure out. Now, what is interesting, Ernst, is that there are some females that you can say, look, snap it up, I need it ASAP. And they get it because they kind of like either operating on the same line as you or working towards it. So they're like, okay, fine. Yeah. But then there are others who don't really get it, or they have a different feeling about it. And so you have to change your tone for one when you don't have to change it for the other one. And you have to know the difference. And the question is, in your strategic planning, do you really have to consider these? Are these things really relevant? Well, welcome to risk. Because if you don't focus on some of it, sometimes you run the risk of leaving certain people disillusioned within the firm and who are responsible for getting information to you and all kinds of other weird and crazy consequences. They might even report you or lie on you or say that you're too bloody pushy with your budget, ASAP, like on TV or whatever, even though you don't mean anything by it. You just want the information because you have issues of your own to deal with. Okay? So yes, I'm so happy. Sandy raised the issue of being home and the risk of spending more money. You raised the issue of in the firm, you have to be thinking about certain things in terms of people's makeup, how they feel about things, how they respond to certain things versus other things. These are very real issues. And if you're going to mitigate those risks connected to them, somehow we have to all find a way to balance it. And that is not always easy. Okay? That is not always easy. I had to say, Ernst, for you and for our ladies in the room, most of the time, like when I'm dealing with my wife of many decades, because I know of her emotional makeup, because women tend to be a little more emotional than men. Like the feelings get hurt a little easier, generally speaking. Not that men don't get their feelings hurt. Be careful with that. I'm not saying that. So usually my conversation with my wife is really like gentle, Ernst, like generally, because I know that she's like a little, like that. So, but every now and then, if I have to make a point so that she can remember something important, because sometimes, our wives take things for granted and all that stuff. So you have to like be firm in your resolve on certain issues. So I'll say something in what she considers to be a stern voice. So she said, why'd you say it like that? I said, because I want you to remember how important it is. She said, but you didn't have to say it like, I said, what do you want me to say? You want me to say it like a pussycat then? And if I do that, I would not be acting naturally the way I was designed. Do you want that? No. I said, good, because I don't want you to change either. But the point I'm making is we have to look at these things and balance them as best as we could and try to understand them in their context so that we can keep the related risk to a minimum. Because don't presume that ignoring these things completely will not create some risk issues, for sure, in one form or another. Okay? So yeah, thank you for raising those two very divergent issues, but very, very important, very relevant as we speak, very strategic in nature, even though it may not appear that way because we're so busy looking at marketplace risk and financial risk and hazard risk and all the other sophisticated risk issues that sometimes we forget the very fundamental ones, like the ones mentioned by Sandy and the ones mentioned by Ernst. Okay. All right. So then what are some of the elements of the risk management function we should be looking at to try and help us with these problems, these risk issues that we have? Very important to identify the risk. I think we said that before. Okay? Identify the risk, what it is you're going to be doing to try to resolve your issues. Okay? Figure out what your risk management goals are for the organization and then seek ways to deal with them. That's the mission. Okay? Then it is very important once you establish the mission to come up with the assessment of the risk. See, the assessment. Man, it is easier said than done. What do we mean by assessment and uncertainty? Well, what are the hazards that can hit your organization potentially? What are you exposed to? What clients are in your portfolio that can bring you pain and suffering because of their activities in certain jurisdictions and so on? You have to be making those assessments, analyze them, measure them, and decide if a client, for example, is not good for your organization's reputation, you may need to de-risk them. In modern language, that means find a way to close that account somehow. Because based on your assessment and your mission, you've decided as a firm that that particular account is not good for you. For example, any financial institution right now has a Russian oligarch in it. That could be a problem. Will all the firms disclose properly that they do or do not have Russian oligarchs? We don't know. One thing is certain, if you don't, it extends your risk significantly in the current environment. Because if it is discovered that you do, or you're violating sanctions in any way, for example, you are putting your entity, your firm, into major risk category. Maybe hazard risk, quadrant on the bottom right in red, hazard risk. Okay. All right. Then, once we identify our mission, what our assessment of our risks are, then we have to decide how are we going to control them. How are we going to control them? And remember, in our previous discussion, we said things like we can avoid the risk, we can seek to prevent it if possible, or we can take steps to reduce it. And again, these risk control measures will depend on the nature of the risk, the type of assessment you make, and what the mission or the identity of the firm is in terms of managing risk. So some firms like to take risks. How about that? Okay, just like some people. So, man, why are you doing this too risky? I love risk. And just how some people love risks. Like there's an old saying back in the day that some girls like to date like risky guys, like drug dealers and, you know, like really hard mean bikers who, you know, kind of guy. And somebody said, don't you know there's a high risk to this? Yeah, but I like it. So some people like risk for some strange reason and seek to take risk all the time, climb mountains, jump, bungee jump, do all kinds of stuff. And then others, yeah, we don't like risk at all. Okay? We avoid it at all costs, we prevent it at all costs, we reduce it wherever we can, we just don't want to have a discussion about it. Okay? So depending on who's leading your firm, they might be into risk or they might be completely risk averse. Two extremes, figure out the middle ground. In the interim, all hell is breaking loose depending on what the results are within any particular firm. And we see this every day, okay, for sure. Can we finance risk? Sometimes we can. Some firms even try to finance the risk. Some firms try to set up a sinking fund, put money away to cover potential losses that they think might occur from hurricane or some other fire or some other issue. And others, of course, seek to insure against risk and just pay a premium, hoping all the time that nothing will ever happen. Okay? And then the final step or the final element has to do with how do we manage this thing from day to day? How do we make it operational? How do we go from the strategic to operational and do it every day? That's the key. Sometimes it's more of a challenge for some firms than you might think. Okay? I don't know if anybody's looked at this model. but it's an interesting model about probability and impact of risk. And does anybody understand this model to begin with? Like, does anybody understand it? What is this model? Can you pick one thing from this model and that shows that you understand something in the model? Anyone? Don't worry about being wrong. Run the risk of being wrong. So what? Anyone? Pick something in the model. Tell me what one of these quadrants is telling us in terms of probability and impact. Take a risk. And you guys are not risk takers at all.
I'll take a jab at it.
Thank you very much. That's the way to go. Take a risk.
So I am thinking if something happened at the organization and the impact is moderate,
Okay.
the probability being high, and I am looking where it says the management effort is required. So it wasn't, what happened wasn't, I would say, detrimental. However, should it occur again, if it's a recurring incident or issue, it can become high risk.
Yes.
So it's something that needs to be addressed right away.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much. That's exactly what it's saying. Okay. And that's really how we should read each and every quadrant in this model. And if folks sit down and look at the different categories in terms of what she just said, you might be surprised to see what kinds of tools or things you can implement to manage your risk. Absolutely. Absolutely. What about if the impact is severe or critical and the probability is low? What can we expect to happen given this model? The impact is severe, but the probability is low. Which quadrant are we looking in? The impact is severe and the probability is low. Which quadrant is affected by that scenario? Take a risk. Remember, this is a risk class.
Would it be the substantial management required?
Absolutely. Okay. So if the impact is deemed to be by management critical or severe, even though the probability might be low, they don't want to take the chance because they know if it happens. See, if nothing happens, fine. But in a severe situation, management wants to be directly involved in making a decision on how to deal with that. Because they know that should it happen, that once in a lifetime thing, and they're not ready, that might be the end of it, the whole program, whatever it might be within the firm. Okay, so yes, absolutely. One other question on the model. If we have a quadrant that says we should monitor and manage risk, what impact probability scenario must exist in order for that quadrant to exist? Monitor and manage risk, the bottom right-hand corner.
That's the medium. Severe impact with a medium probability.
Severe impact with a medium probability.
Mm-hmm. Or are you talking about the high and the limited minor?
Okay, the high probability and the
limited minor.
Yes. So the fact that you were able to switch and look at the alternative means that basically you grasp what this model is all about. And I'm hoping that as a result of that, everybody else gets to see how this works. Absolutely right. Okay. So again, this model really is what we call a generic model, risk management model, but it can be applied to any type of entity given the nature of your environment. Okay? It's like this, Ernst. Ernst, you still single?
From a legal perspective, yeah.
I'm picking on you because you're the only guy in the room. Okay, so from a legal perspective, that sounds risky. What does that mean?
That means not married.
Okay, okay. You know I know what you mean. I just want you to take the rest to say. Okay, so that means then you should know by now that if you dated Mary at some point and then you dated Jean at some point, even though they're both girls, you cannot use the same approach for both of them, correct?
Agreed.
Why not?
Because Mary might be more risky for me. And Jean, you might have grown up in a good household, and Mary would have not been afforded that same luxury.
True. In other words, they're different for whatever reason. Even though they're both girls, they have different personalities. And so when we look at these models, we see the generic nature of the model, but we have to apply the model concepts given our particular job environment. And a lot of times firms don't really want to sit down and mess with this stuff. But truly, if you take a little time, one day, brainstorm, get people in the room even, get key members of staff, if not everyone, in a room and just talk about it. Have somebody write things down. You'll be surprised to know what will come out of the mouths of staff members when you start looking at assessing the firm's risk. Okay? They might surprise you, come up with some very interesting things. And then you can take that information and then create a model. And then by looking at the model, you can see right away, what should you put major focus on? What should you put minor focus on? It's as simple as that. Notice when probability is high and impact is severe, it requires extensive management. Crucial. Extensive management is crucial in this process because they cannot afford for this thing to happen. It could probably completely ruin the firm. Okay? So again, every firm, all it has to do is take its risk issues, build it into the model, and they'll see whether they need to be dealing with stuff severely or gently or in between, moderately. That's the deal. All right. More definitions of risk. I'm sure you probably know them all by now. To preserve the firm, to analyze the problems, to come up with a defense strategy on how to minimize your risk and your exposure. Do you have a coordinated strategy towards risk? Is everybody moving in the same direction? Or is everybody in a different direction? Or some people don't even know what the direction is. All right, these are all part of the definition of risk management because they all come into play in the process. And how well we manage these things will determine the success, failure, comfort, discomfort level, returns or losses for the particular firms that you work for. Again, a lot of you guys may not be involved directly in this process, so you don't really see it happening. But I can assure you, it is happening somewhere. And if it's not happening, not happening in terms of risk means something is happening. What is happening is not happening. Okay? That's the crazy thing about risk. So putting your head in the sand doesn't mean it's not happening. Okay? That's the key. Some firms feel that if they don't deal with it, somehow it'll go away. I don't know where that came from, but some of them still feel that way. Maybe if we don't have to do what the regulators say, maybe next time they come, they will not remember this one. Or they might fine us the same amount of money, so we'll budget for that next time and just pay it. Or whatever people come up with in their minds not to follow through with these risk issues. Okay? Very interesting we come up with. So it follows then that risk has a cycle. We've seen it indirectly so far. Now we have a more direct approach to the risk management cycle. And it's like almost any other cycle. It goes around and around and around, and it has specific characteristics attached to each part of the cycle. Okay? Like, for example, the risk analysis has to do with identification and evaluation. The policy making has to do with determining what levels require protection, what level requires more allocation of resources, etc. And then the third step in the cycle has to do with the planning process, safety and security planning. How are we going to go about that? What procedures we're going to have in place in order to eliminate potential risks and to keep our losses to a minimum. And why do we call it a cycle? Because when you get to the end, which is the continuous review process, then you have to constantly go back to the beginning again. So you're reviewing the current process this year of all the things you've done in the cycle, and then you go back and you do it again. You see if there are any new risks in the risk analysis. Do we require any new or different policy making issues? Do we need to remove anything? Okay. So it is a cycle. It's not something you do once and say, thank God, let me send this to the regulators so they don't bother us anymore. It doesn't work that way. Cycle means it's a constant revolving of the risk issues. And I think the sooner firms come to grips with that, see that? It's a cycle. Okay. Nice little clean diagram to show you the very same cycle we looked at a minute ago. Okay. Identify, measure, analyze, decide, implement, monitor. Identify, measure, analyze, decide, implement, monitor. Add, subtract, put in new stuff, take out old stuff. Put in more relevant stuff, take out irrelevant stuff. That doesn't apply anymore. That was last year. This is now. Something has changed. The law has changed. The rules have changed. The regulators have changed. Changed the risk cycle issues to commensurate with the changes. And who wants to go through all that? But that's really what regulators are requiring firms to do. Because when you do that, as much as it might be a pain in the butt sometimes, it helps you to keep your firm balanced, and it helps to keep your firm out of major potential problems. Questions for this risk class? Are all Russian clients high risk? Anyone?
Yes.
They're all high risk. That's what I'm talking about. Yes. Anybody disagrees with her?
Can you repeat that, please?
Are all Russian clients high risk?
Yes.
Is
Are
that
you saying-
because, is that due to the war in Russia?
Not necessarily, because they were doing stuff before the war.
Okay.
Are you saying yes just because of the war and you're mad at Putin, or are you saying yes in general that they're high risk?
Yes, in general.
Yes,
I
in
think it's a
general.
high-risk country. It's a high-risk country.
It is. It is indeed a high-risk jurisdiction by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, all the countries that have closed systems like Russia, China, Africa, and certain Middle Eastern countries and others that have closed information systems, they tend to be high risk because you cannot get relevant information from them. And information you do get, there's a struggle trying to figure out if it's true or not. So yes. So if that's the case, how is it you think then, given these risk-related issues, that China has been so successful in moving around the world, despite the risk associated with that country? How have they been so successful? Is China a high-risk country? Jurisdiction? When the Chinese clients show up, should you say, no problem, come right this way? We don't see you as a high-risk jurisdiction? Is that true? Take a risk. It's a risk class, remember?
They should be considered high risk, but what we've been seeing is not the case.
Yeah,
I would,
go ahead.
I would suggest that they're medium risk.
Medium?
Yes.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. Why medium?
From my perspective, the reason why is because they have more diplomatic relationships with with other countries, including first world countries like the US. Um, and they won't be, they, even though they have somewhat of a closed system, just from my personal experience with working in a law firm,
Right?
they are very forthcoming with information or documentation that is necessary based on the transactions that they do.
Wow.
So that's the reason why I offer medium risk.
And given your experience, medium risk is certainly the appropriate rating in your experience, for sure.
Yes. And not to say that they would not have a checklist that they would have to provide or, support. Um, but I wouldn't, or from my experience, I wouldn't suggest 100% high risk.
Indeed, indeed. Nor would you present 100% low risk for obvious
Oh,
reasons.
necessary? No,
Yeah.
definitely not.
That's Kayleen, that's an interesting perspective. And it's what is uh, good about that perspective is um, there are many even compliance officers around the world who would consider China an outright high risk jurisdiction just because of their closed shop agenda. They don't say much about much. And a lot of times when stuff is going on, you're not really sure whether it is reliable or not. But again, it's like sometimes it's like dealing with people. Some person might say, well, that person is an X person. And then when you deal with them, you find out there's somebody else in your opinion. And perhaps in dealing with clients, for example, we have to take the approach that we will risk rate them according to our experience and according to their responses to our requirements. And so your perspective in that regard um, is a very interesting and substantive one, and a position that a lot of people might not be bold enough to take, but it does have its basis in terms of your rationale. And really, this is how risk decisions need to be made.
Yeah, so, and you did point that out because I'm in a law firm and I am the compliance officer. Well, I fill that role also, and that's the reason why, because it's based on the responsiveness also of the client, the longevity and the history of the client. So I'm not just saying a blanket across the board, but based on the clients that we have engaged or had any business with. That's the reason why we risk rated them at medium based on the compliance side of it.
Um, and that is a very, very sound perspective, especially if you're tying it into your experience in terms of they are complying with the requirements that you want. You haven't seen them crop up on any lists. You haven't gotten any negative media that turns out to be substantive. Whatever it is that we establish as our criteria.
And to
Right?
add to it too, the transactions aren't complicated or complex, so they're property transactions what are straightforward. So that also So adds to our reasoning for risking at medium level.
Indeed, because once it comes to property issues, there is only a limited amount of things that you need to substantiate, and you want to make sure you do that sufficiently. And once you get past that sufficiency, then the rest is pretty straightforward. Yes. Okay. The mortgage is done and everybody's happy. Um, so yeah, again, and certainly that's in your experience. I'm sure some other firm might say, maybe, but in our experience, that particular guy or girl, we couldn't get half of what we needed, and nothing turned out to be true. So everything is relevant, and we have to make our assessments based on what is before us in terms of whether or not the client meets the criteria for what we require them to do. Okay? Very important. We don't want to blacklist anybody. We don't want to operate on hearsay. We want to deal with each person, each client on a one-on-one basis, and that's really how we should. Because there are certain jurisdictions, no matter how good the client might be, once they come from that jurisdiction, dog eat their lunch. It's like when Jesus was on his mission, they said, nothing good can come out of Nazareth. So whatever he does, don't believe it, ignore it, let's go. Just because he was born in Nazareth. And Nazareth in those days were like, I guess, Town or something in the Bahamas, kind of rough area. And so there were certain people who said, they like, he's from Nazareth? Man, let's go. There's nothing good comes out of Nazareth. And we know for sure that with regards to that Nazarene, that is not true. And to some extent, we need to take that same approach with our clients, measure them on their own merit, and make the decisions accordingly. That way, I think you keep your risk to a minimum in terms of how you do business. And the impact not only that it'll have on your firm, you as an individual, but the country as a whole. It's another thing. It's not only our firms that are affected, I said that earlier, countries are affected as well, okay? For sure. All right. So how do we handle the risk then? Well, there are a bunch of ways we can do it. Every firm has its own way, which includes no way. Right? But we have to have something in place. And this stuff is just to kind of get your mind wondering in case you're confronted with risk, mitigation issues, how to perhaps approach some things. For example, you may say, okay, in our little brainstorming session, we discovered that risk could be avoided, or we can keep it, we can transfer it, we can share it, or we can try to reduce it as much as possible. And then list those things as ways of handling our risk. Nothing wrong with that. Really, those are all the things we should be thinking about when it comes to managing any risk that we identify. For example, if you're a teacher and you discover that a child is not reading well, it would not be a good idea to avoid that issue. Teacher would want to take that on head on and make some recommendations on how that student can improve their reading. So that's not a case to avoid. The consequences of avoidance is too great. That means the child then grows up not being able to read properly, or in some cases, not being able to read at all. Okay? So it's kind of like that. The firm has to decide, given the nature and type of risks that they have, for each individual risk, which of these things are they going to consider and why? And again, another area to be brainstormed, discussed, looked at, just to make sure that you're getting the best input in terms of how to handle your risk. And again, remember, sometimes lower level staff have some interesting things to add depending on the firm that you have. Doesn't hurt to get their opinion, okay, for sure. Okay. So, how do we avoid risk? Should we avoid it? Well, typically we avoid risk when the individual or company decides not to accept it at all. Not to accept it at all. You want to avoid risk associated with a property? That's Kayleen's property thing. How ironic. Do not purchase the property. Do not lease it and do not rent it. How about that? Because you don't want any property risk. Period. You don't want any property risk. Do not buy it. Do not lease it. Do not rent. See, that's what avoidance is all about. Okay? We are told that risk avoidance is what we call a negative technique of handling risk. That's interesting. Under risk avoidance, there's no gain without taking some risk. You have to. If you're going into business and you don't want to deal with property, then you're stuck because you have to buy it, lease it, or rent it in some form or another. So if you want to avoid them completely, then what kind of return are you going to get out of that? None. You have to take some degree of risk. Okay. That's an interesting concept. There are some other areas of risk that you should avoid. And for example, can somebody think of a risk that you should avoid? In this case, you shouldn't avoid it because then you can't expect any returns. But what kind of risk would you think would be good to avoid? Anyone? What kind of risk would be good to avoid? That would be accepted, unacceptable. Yeah, it's interesting when you have to actually sit down and think about these things.
But lending somebody money and they have no, let's say they have no means of income or no means of paying back.
Yeah, I like that one. That's called credit risk, but it's different from the normal credit risk. The normal credit risk is when you give money to somebody who's working or have the means to pay it back. But that person who is not working has no means to pay it back. That kind of risk you should avoid at all costs, unless you've decided that there's some other benefit in doing that. See? That's interesting. But if you can determine if there's any other benefit, then that kind of risk you should avoid by all means. Okay, for sure. All right. Now, that's risk avoidance. Remind me of when my son was going to university 3 years ago, 4 years ago when he was first getting started. One of my big concerns was the university campus. Does anybody know what my concern was potentially for the university campus? Any parents in the room? I wouldn't ask parents because he's not a parent yet. Any parents in the room? When your child is going to university, what is one of the big issues that is a concern, other than the academic commitment?
Travel risk?
Okay, travel risk. Okay, yeah, but we can live with that. What kind of risk that bothers you a little bit more than travel risk?
Safety risk.
Safety meaning?
Safety away from home on a campus by themselves, probably with no, I don't know, getting into the wrong company or getting involved in other things.
Yeah.
I don't
know. Yeah, we do know. You're right. The wrong company. That is a major risk. If you think travel risk is a problem, check the wrong company risk. Oftentimes, that is the greatest problem of all. The wrong company risk. So many students, so many people even, have not even survived the wrong company risk. And those who survive have been tortured because they get caught in the wrong company risk, by all means. That kind of risk should be avoided. But for some people, they can't seem to avoid it. They love it. So don't tell me who to hang with. I'll do what I feel like. I'm my own whatever. When in fact, when you identify and assess that risk, see that stuff we talked about earlier? When you identify, assess it, and review it, you find out that's not a good idea. And so you try to warn them to avoid that risk. See, risk avoidance. And they're like, I'll do whatever I want. Okay? All right. So that's risk avoidance, that negative technique, which holds well in some cases and does not hold well in others. The firm and the individual have to decide which route and what things that they will apply it to. And even that, there's risk of making the wrong decision. Fascinating. All right.
Mr. Wilkinson, is that the same as voluntary risk retention? Like getting into, when you asked about the student, your child going off to college and they getting involved in the wrong company, etc. Would that be a part of voluntary risk retention?
Yes, and it's interesting that you were able to look at the voluntary risk retention concept and make that application. It absolutely is. Okay, and as you can see, where a person or an entity does not take a positive action to avoid, yes, in this case, avoiding bad company, reduce or transfer risk, then it's voluntary because you are putting yourself in jeopardy. Interestingly enough, you're absolutely right. That's a hugely important correlation. Okay, so now running into the wrong company, you can actually give it a name, a big time formal name now. It's called voluntary risk retention. But yes, couldn't put it better myself. That's a very, very good correlation. And to be honest with you, when I was talking about bad company, I really wasn't thinking about voluntary risk until you said it. Okay, and that ties absolutely in the section that says not taking action to avoid. Okay? It reminds me when I was a little boy, I spent a little while with my grandparents before going back to my mom for 2 years or so, going to a school in that area. And my grandparents, of course, were very old school. And one of the things they hated was children who always wanted to be around what they call company. That was the word for company. They always said that if you hung around company for too long, company is going to persuade you to do something you should not do. And so that was a carnal sin. I thought they didn't want me to have friends, but then I discovered when I got older that that was not the reason. What they were really doing was trying to keep me from getting involved in some voluntary risk retention program. Because their thing was, when you go to school, you play at school. When you come home, do not hang around with the wrong people. When you're out there, avoid bad company. And they were very adamant about that. And if you violated that rule, you live to regret it. And I guess the old people who only had a 6th grade education, they understood the context of voluntary risk retention very clearly. Because all these decades later, I have no regrets about that lesson. Very important one. Doesn't mean you be antisocial, just means what it means. All right. And then on the other hand, we have involuntary risk. What do you think that means? Is that the opposite of voluntary? I guess. Unknowingly retained risk. The risk is not recognized or known. Okay, fair enough. There's loss without realizing that there's loss. Okay? You might be a cautious driver, not realizing the danger that lie ahead by somebody who's what? Speeding, drunk, high. So if they kill you or your children, That is considered to be involuntary risk. You're doing everything you're supposed to do. You're driving within the speed limit. You have on your seatbelts. Everybody's locked in. But lo and behold, the drunk, high, or otherwise driver speeding along runs into you, who's driving cautiously, destroys everybody in your car. And in some cases, they say they don't even remember because they were too drunk or high. Before we go on beyond that example, what should we do with such a driver, anyone? They run into people, create major damage and even death. And because they're so drunk or high or otherwise, they don't even remember. They say, what should we do with them? How do we mitigate that?
We should prosecute under the full extent of the law so that would mitigate other persons from doing it. I have a personal story to share.
Please do.
I actually have a son. I have a child.
Yes.
Caden is 4.
Yes.
And he lost his aunt in December due to a drunk driver.
You mean December just gone?
Yeah.
So this is a recent tragedy.
Correct.
This isn't something back in 1973 when the bloody Bahamas became independent, correct?
Right.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the challenge, and here's the challenge with this. The driver was ejected, the drunk driver was ejected from the vehicle.
Yes.
He survived.
Yes.
But Danielle didn't make it. And
no, the same old bloody story. Sorry.
Right. And she left behind 2 boys both under the age of 5. And it's heartbreaking. And he's still alive and well, and he's able to go about his life with no repercussions. And he's the one who's actually at fault. So it's kind of...
Ernst, he's not in prison?
No.
How come? What the hell happened there? Who the hell was mitigating that?
I'm still trying to figure out why.
He is not in prison?
So Caden's grandmother is actively seeking legal action now, but nothing has been happening since. Nothing has been done since.
My God, the same old problem. Not here, the US and other countries. Drunk, high speeding drivers continue to walk away from these tragedies, and most of them don't even spend a day in prison. And here's our summary of it. Oh, it was a bloody accident. And don't accidents happen? And we need to get it together. That's why we can't get anything resolved in this jurisdiction. We keep playing around with issues that we need to deal with. You know, many years ago, persons approached me about running for office, and I'm like, you guys don't want me to run for office because I have a tendency to want to deal with things, quote unquote, the correct way. Does that mean I'm a perfect human being? Of course not. But it does mean I have a tendency to do that, which means that in today's modern politics, I wouldn't last 55 seconds. Did you see that driver, Ernst? If I was a judge, that driver was going to spend a minimum of 20 years in prison, whether he or she remembers or not, on principle, just as you said, to send the message so that we can reduce the incidences of, see, we have a name for it now, Ernst, involuntary flicking risk, correct? So you can give that expression to your Grammy and tell the lawyer that's involuntary risk that needs to be mitigated. Find a way to get that guy in prison. I don't care if he doesn't remember. He should not have been drunk in the first place and driving. If you're drunk, lay down and go to sleep. Let somebody take you home. If you're high, lay down and go to sleep, or let somebody take you home. The minute you get behind the wheel, you are responsible, period.
And the challenge is that's not even an adequate response or excuse to say, well, I don't remember, or I was drunk,
No,
because I and like I said, it is heartbreaking because I'm spending time with my son, and it was a few weeks back, and we were walking because he told me he wanted to go to Atlanta, so we were walking on the sidewalk where the buses would park, and he was like, "Daddy, please carry me because I don't want to get hit by a car."
Absolutely.
So a 4-year-old remembers what happened. So it's kind of like,
yes, he remembered, and probably will never forget. Isn't that crazy? So now the guy's walking free. His aunt is gone, leaving behind 2 infants, and your son is still remembering that crap. Man, something needs to be done. Okay. It's a good thing I'm not a lawyer. I'll do that free. Friends, just on principle alone, because I'm sick and tired of that scenario here and abroad. If you're drunk, lay down or let somebody take you. I don't want to hear the excuse. It is not acceptable. Sorry. If you're high, lay down and let somebody drop you. It is not acceptable.
And
If you are, yes.
Mr. Wilkinson, that goes for most countries too, because I have a cousin who lost her dad that exact same way in Tampa, and the driver is alive and didn't spend time in prison at all.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's very common. It's common across the United States. It's common in Canada. And I'm sure it's common in many other parts of the world. But in the Western world, it's rampant. These kinds of drivers, even people who are breaking the speed limit, who are not high, they're just flicking speeding.
Yep.
That is no excuse.
Yep.
Period. But they keep walking away. And my question is, why do we keep letting them walk away? My position personally, if one of my sons get drunk and drive and hit somebody and or injure or kill them, put them in prison. Of course, I'm not going to like it, but they're going to have to take responsibility for their actions, especially since I already told them from they were 4, don't drink and drive. When they were 10, 15, 20, and now, don't do it. Don't speed. None of that crap. Don't drive with somebody who is drunk, high, or speeding. See, that's the other thing. Talk about college risk. That's the next thing. When my sons were going to college, I thought the biggest risk was having unprotected sex and hanging out with the wrong people, because that's risky stuff. Then I discovered, wait a minute, it's another one. Driving with people who are high, drunk, or flicking speeding. You're not even the driver. You're driving with a person who is like that. So what is my big time mitigator? If somebody is high, drunk, or speeding, do not get into the car.
Yeah. Or you be the designated driver.
Yes. And sometimes they don't let you. They gang up on you and say, boy, or whatever they say, Ernst. Boy, I driving. I don't care if I drunk. So if they do that, tell them, thank you. I'll see you guys at the dorm or wherever the hell it is. Don't go in the car. Then they're going to try and straighten you. We're going to punk you out. I can drive, but get in the car, huh? Whatever they say. Or for female, same thing. Don't do it. amazing how people let people persuade them in these situations to get into a car with a speeding driver, a drunk driver, or a driver who's high. Truly amazing. Males and females. Truly amazing. Second only to the fact that they keep flicking walking away scot-free after injuring people and killing them over and over and over. Okay. Sorry, that's a sore point for me as well. Thank you for guys for sharing those issues because they are very real. And December, it was her. The other time it was your cousin. And tomorrow it's me or you or one of our children. Just like that. Yet, didn't we have an incident in the Bahamas the other day, not too long ago, guy was driving up the hill when they had some kind of group of people rallying or something. And he ran into two people? Wasn't that in the Bahamas? NASA. Anybody remembers that?
What's that?
Yes.
It's a Labor Day March.
Yeah,
Yes.
the Labor Day March,
Oh,
the guy
yeah,
speeding
yeah.
to the people.
Yeah.
And I understand that he only got a fine.
Wow.
Didn't people die?
Didn't a couple people died?
Yes, two.
Um,
In Nassau last year or whatever the hell it was. Recent memory. The guy did not spend one single, they didn't even have the decency to lock him up for a year, which was not enough. I said the decency in honor of the death of not one person, two. Man, I need to leave that topic before I drop dead at the computer. This is crazy. Okay? Maybe one day you guys will be in charge of something and change it. I see them coming up with all kinds of laws for citizenship, laws for marital rape, laws for this, laws for the age of consent. Fine. But nobody's coming up with laws to deal with drunken drivers, drivers who are high in speeds who kill people. Where's that law? Anyone? I haven't heard it. I guess it's not a priority. And they tell maybe one of their relatives get killed by such a driver. And maybe a law will come quicker than we would imagine. I don't know. Point is, it's a big problem in the Commonwealth. Absolutely, just as you said. All right. Hold on it. Voluntary and involuntary risk. That's deep. And so, again, we're talking about this stuff in the context of an organization, but it does have extensions. And we just had the discussion about how these things can be extended outside of the firm. And just how we have tragedies outside the firm, we have tragedies in the firm when we don't come up with the proper risk management issues, mitigations. We see it all the time. Firms shut down, people get fired and because of no fault of their own, poor decision making. The firm is fined significant amounts of money, whatever the case might be, all because we don't manage our risk effectively. Same kinds of problems. All right, so we can avoid it. We can retain it voluntarily or involuntarily. We can transfer it. Oftentimes we buy insurance to transfer the risk or some of it to the insurer. Hedging in financial positions just means buying a certain kind of security in case the prices go up or down. You'll be covered with the losses will be minimal or non-existent. These are called transferring the risk when you get some kind of insurance to protect our risk. And then of course we have the risk reduction. And how to reduce risk? By taking safety measures. And we have some interesting examples here for risk reduction, like non-organizational stuff. Does a sprinkler system apply to a firm as a risk reduction measure?
it does.
It does. How come?
Well, I know I work at, well, everyone know where I work, but our the outside of our shopping centers, they have persons responsible for the maintaining of the grounds and stuff, like the lawn and the parking lots,
Yes,
because customers can get injured. Um, and so that's a risk.
of course, and sue you
Yeah.
by all means. If the building gets on fire and people, staff and customers are in there, a sprinkler system would perhaps put out the fire or help to put out the fire and save a whole lot of loss. So
Yeah.
you sprinkler in, the sprinkler out.
I didn't
But
even I didn't even think about inside. That's true.
indeed,
Inside as well, yeah.
indeed. Okay.
We have slip and falls often.
Does anybody sue?
They you can't sue in the Bahamas. At least I mean, we have cases where we end up having to pay medical bills, etc. But in terms of legal proceedings and stuff, I don't think we had any cases where we had to go to court.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some
If
of
that
them were kind of forged though.
I know. But forged or not, if that was in the US, if they buck their finger, they'll sue you.
Yeah.
And they'll sue you to hell. It's just that Bahamians continue to be very quiet, docile, sweet people who don't like to sue yet. And everybody knows it. And oftentimes we take great advantage of that as well. And like you said, it's interesting. There's a general belief that it doesn't make sense suing because you don't get any results. That might be true to some extent, but not entirely. But it's enough to get people. Sorry?
I say I had it a lot. How is it that our police force gets sued? Persons are successful in police and suing the police, the law enforcement or the police force.
Yeah, the government.
But how is that possible when you can't sue like malpractice at the hospital?
Exactly.
Well, yeah, the truth
And
is,
that's a recurring situation all the time. That happens.
yeah, the truth of the matter is, so far we don't have a problem suing the government because we say the government has the money to pay, which is the taxpayers' money, and the government is supposed to be the beacon of the country. So it can't look as if it's suppressing the law and all this kind of stuff, whatever the reasons are. That doesn't mean that we cannot and should not sue hospitals for malpractice, for example, or lawyers who run off with people's money. The problem is we keep giving the impression generally that it's a waste of time to do it. And sometimes it is even difficult to find a lawyer who is prepared to do it because of the politics of the country. Unfortunately, yeah.
It's a long, drawn up process, and the money that you have to spend to get, like it. Some people get it. You turned off by it.
Indeed.
But I think it's unfair.
It is.
I'll
tell you, about 15 years ago, I had a lady who had a fall somewhere, and she was trying to get a lawyer to file a lawsuit without any success. Believe it or not, she was having trouble, just as you said. Then, because she knew me, she said, you know, I keep having trouble getting somebody to bring a lawsuit. I've been trying to get them to force the insurance company to make a payout. And for some reason, they are reluctant or they're not being successful. They just keep giving me the runaround and keep paying a little here, paying a little there, but nothing's happening. So being the person that I tend to be sometime in these matters, because that kind of stuff, anyway, it's another sore point. I said, you know what? What's the name of the company, the insurance company that you're trying to get the payout from? She gave me the name. So I said, because, you know, I did some accounting work for her and all this stuff. So I said, I'm not a lawyer, but I know what to do. Do you want me to write them? Yes, I'll do anything at this stage of the game. So I wrote the company. I said that I understand that you are the company that represents this organization where this lady fell, and she's been making a claim, trying to make a claim, and she's been unsuccessful. Of course, they give me the runaround initially. And I gave them the runaround, they gave me the runaround, and I wouldn't let it go. And they started getting pissed off with me, and I wouldn't let it go. And I told them, if they do not do something out of court, if they do not make a settlement out of court, I will find a way to get it to court. And they'll have to pay 5 times the amount, potentially. And they gave me the runaround, I gave them the runaround, they gave me the runaround. So finally, I said enough, and I was persistent enough that they decided they didn't want to deal with the risk. See, they wanted to avoid the risk of going to court. See? And even though I was not a lawyer, I would still present the case. You don't have to be a lawyer to present a case. Did you know that? They just say you should have a lawyer because the lawyer is supposed to understand the law better. But you don't have to be a lawyer. In fact, you can represent yourself in court. Did you know that? If you have enough information to do it.
Yep.
All right. A lot of people don't know that either. So I told them, I'm an accountant by profession. That's when I was an accountant by profession. And but I will present this matter to the court. I'll make a submission on behalf of this person if you don't pay, if you don't settle. Eventually, they decided, after I gave them some good reasons to think about, that they were going to settle the matter out of court. And that lady got somewhere around $250,000. Can you believe it? So this thing is not impossible. It's just a matter of finding somebody who will pursue the matter sufficiently and who does not have any quote unquote allegiance to whatever we have allegiances to. How's that? That's as gently as I can put that. But it is unfortunate that people still have the feeling that it doesn't make sense suing in the Bahamas because you will be unsuccessful anyway. I don't know where the hell that originated, but it is most unfortunate. Okay? Hopefully that too, like the drunk driver, the speedster, and the person who's high and driving, hopefully that too will be resolved eventually. Maybe the next generation, you guys, perhaps. All right. And then, of course, yes, risk reduction, where we try to put things in place to keep our risk down. The sprinkler, the alarm, trading limits in the markets, protecting profits, and so on. All these things are designed to keep our risk down. Are we always successful? Hell no. We can't ever get rid of risk. We already said that. But we try to keep it down. Okay? All right, just some rules of risk management for you guys as you go about doing what you do. Sooner or later, you're going to be confronted with some kind of risk on the job or off. So let's look at some basic rules you should be thinking about. Do not risk more than you can afford to lose. That makes sense. That always makes sense. Number 2, if the maximum potential loss is so large that it can result in bankruptcy or such loss, retention of the risk is not wise. Don't do it. Okay, that's too deep. Basic rules of risk management. Do never risk more than you can afford to lose. If you're going to put some money out there for something, make sure it's only the amount you can afford to lose. Don't put your house papers, your pension fund, all this nonsense. Because somebody came to you in a suit with a deal that was too good to be true and a nice, handsome smile or a beautiful smile, or whatever the case might be. Don't do it. Even if it looks glamorous, only risk what you can afford to lose. If the maximum risk is so great, don't do it. Consider the odds. If it's against you, don't do it. See, it's not complicated. We could use like a complicated words like if one can determine the probability that a loss may come that I have there. We could use that if we want to. But consider the odds means if the odds are against you, don't do it. That's a simple way. If the odds are against you or your firm or whatever, don't do it. Don't risk a lot for a little. Yes, my foot, that's deep. Do not risk a lot for a little. Wow. So don't fail to insure your building or property or whatever it is just because you don't want to pay that stinky premium that they're giving you. It might be cheaper to pay the premium than the risk total loss. At least with that premium, if something happens, you get something back. Because insurance company is another issue. They don't always want to give you everything back you should get back. So when you insure, you run the risk of not getting back everything you should. But at least you don't have to take on the entire risk or loss if something happens. Do not risk a lot for a little. These are some interesting rules of risk management. Applied correctly, they can save you a lot of pain and suffering. I can assure you. I know. I've seen them many times. I've tested them many times. Because of some of these rules, I don't even go to second base. So somebody says, how much can you afford to lose? And you say, 2,000. And they say, well, I need 5,000 to make this work. And tell them you need to find somebody else because I can only afford to lose 2. Don't sell your car for the other 3. That's not the idea. Some food for thought. And this, of course, these rules apply at the company level and at the individual level, no matter what entity, profit or non-profit, country or otherwise. The same principles, they still apply. Am I right? All right. Now, we looked at that model. This is only a summary of that model. And some persons made the connections very well. And so this is just a little summary of that model we saw earlier with regards to probability, severity, and all that stuff. And notice what the deal is here. This is a very interesting thing to remember if you could, or at least have it somewhere. When the severity of the potential loss is high, retention is not realistic. Don't try to retain it. Transfer it or do something else. Don't try to retain it. When the severity of the potential loss is high. Even if the probability is low or lower, the severity level should cause you not to retain it. Interesting. When the probability of loss is high, insurance becomes too costly. Now that's interesting. If the probability of losing something is high for whatever the reason, then it doesn't make sense insuring it. I know it seems a little weird, but it's true if you really stop and think about it. That's some food for thought. Because we think that anything with insurance, anything with the word insurance in it is okay, but the truth is it's not. Because if you run the high risk of losing an asset or whatever it might be that can be lost, then what are you insuring it for? Because the probability is high that you're going to lose it anyway. If you're in a country where they have 5 earthquakes in 6 months, what are you insuring? I mean, that may not be a good example for some people, but it does talk about the probability of loss side. Insurance, well, in that case, maybe. But in many other situations, it doesn't make any sense. Number 3, the most appropriate tools for dealing with risk of high severity and high frequency are avoidance and reduction. In case you never thought about it that way. High severity, high frequency, avoid it. Can't avoid it, reduce it as much as you can. Technically, those are the only options for high severity, high frequency. You can choose some other ones, but they won't work as well as avoidance and reduction. And then reduction may be used when it is possible to reduce the potential severity. Reduction may be used when it is possible to reduce the potential severity. Okay, if it's possible. Or the probability of occurrence to a manageable level. Okay, fine. Otherwise, exposure should be avoided. So if you can reduce the severity level and get the probability of it occurring down to a manageable level, avoid it. Avoid exposure to it. Don't do it. Now, this summary, it's not necessarily a summary that you just read over and say, oh, okay, fine. You actually have to sit down and look at each one of these rules and see how and which ones apply to your individual situation, company or individual, before you can take a decision on which ones to apply and which one actually applies to your entities or situation. Okay? So it's not just a matter of understanding the concepts, but you have to also see how they apply in each situation within your firm. Because remember, every risk matter in your firm is not the same. They have different characteristics. So one rule might apply in one case and one might apply in another case and not apply in another case. You just have to go through a process, which probably explains why a lot of firms don't go through a process, because it requires sitting down and messing with some of this stuff. And since everybody's busy doing what they're doing, who has time to mess with this stuff until something explodes? And then you have to pick up the pieces. Okay? High frequency, low severity, we saw that in the model. High frequency, low severity are best dealt with through retention. You can manage that. If it happens a lot, you know, like I have a couple of hurricanes, but they're not too bad, we could retain that risk through insurance or otherwise. High frequency will be too costly to transfer if it would be best to retain the risk. But we can use what we call loss prevention techniques in order to manage the high frequency levels. It's that severity thing that we have to keep our eyes on. What kind of damage can occur if we don't mitigate? If the severity is low, fine, we can work it, we can insure it, we can put some money in a sinking fund to cover it, whatever it is. Okay. On the other hand, if we have high severity and low probability, for example, an earthquake, then perhaps insurance is your answer. Because earthquakes, for example, or Category 5 hurricanes, obviously are devastating. And you do not want to retain them internally. You do want to insure them so that at least you don't have a total loss if something of the severity of an earthquake or a Category 5 hurricane occurs. Okay. And then finally, if the severity is low and the frequency is low, then the company can manage that through retention. We can pay for that on our own, so to speak. Okay. For sure. So these are some interesting models, risk mitigation issues that can work very well for firms who want to take the time to apply them. They are not difficult to put into context once you understand them and take some time or have somebody who is capable, interested, and trying to put these things together in the interest of the company, making some presentation. Again, it never hurts to do it as a group and then see how it fits into your firm. And then once you decide on all that stuff and then you document it, it becomes part of your day-to-day operations, and everybody who needs to know knows. That's how it should really work in practice. Okay? Unfortunately, we don't do that stuff nearly enough. We just hit some key things and whatever happens, happens. That's not the ideal situation. And then that brings us to the final part of our risk discussion, that just kind of talks about the different types of insurance, because most of the time when we think about mitigating risk, we think about insurance. How can we insure it? Okay. Most of the times we don't want to retain it, and the only time we should retain it if it's low severity, low risk anyway. But for the most part, we're thinking of some kind of insurance. Most, not most, but much of which you're familiar with, like the automobile insurance, which we know about only too well. An insurance called boiler insurance, which a lot of people may not be familiar with, but that's the kind of insurance for those companies that have machinery and equipment that break down frequently because of the high amount of work that goes into the production process. So for them, boiler insurance is a very big deal because those machines are very expensive, by the way. Okay? Millions of dollars in some cases. Casualty insurance, most of us are familiar with that. Cover any potential losses. Credit insurance. For the lenders in the room, do we still have credit insurance in the retail banks, anyone?
Yes, we do.
Yes. For the sake of those who may not know, Ernst, can you describe what credit insurance is in the banking, retail banking field?
So it's a type of insurance that banks use. It's an internal insurance for the most part. Some banks outsource it, but for the most part, in my experience, it's been an internal insurance where we kind of hedge against potential risks for loss by putting a couple dollars aside for those instances.
Yes, indeed. And by extension, oftentimes, depending on the financial institution, for each loan that they give to a customer, they might seek to how we call loan insurance or credit insurance in the event the customer dies, that the insurance will pay off the balance of the loan. Okay, that too is considered a kind of credit insurance. Okay, who pays the premium? Well, that's another story. Sometimes the bank pays it entirely. Sometimes the customer pays it entirely. Sometimes it's shared between bank and customer. The only way to find out is to have that conversation with the lender directly. Okay? But these are the kinds of credit insurances that are out there, and that's what they are designed to do primarily. Okay? Not to mention coverage not only for the non-payment of the credit balance on the loan, but also for things like unemployment, disability, and so on. Okay. What else? Financial loss insurance. Okay, we know about that. Well, maybe not. The financial loss insurance covers us institutions and individuals against financial risks. One of the quadrants we saw. Okay. So if a company has a great deal of inventory, it might buy insurance in case there's a fire, hoping that the insurance will pay a substantive amount of the claim that they make for the loss of their inventory. This is what we refer to as financial loss insurance. Okay. Health insurance, we know all about that monster. But by the way, speaking about health insurance, anyone in the class, why is it that health insurance becomes more expensive when we need it the most, like as we get older? Why? And when we don't need it?
Because the risk of us getting older, you get health issues, you tend to get chronic illnesses, and so I guess that's the reason.
Insurance, yeah, you're right.
Or even death.
Yeah,
death
well,
is prone.
Death is what?
They probably look at it, death is more prone as you get older due to, I guess, health deteriorating and stuff.
Potentially, but those 5 guys that got shot last week, they were young.
True. They might not have insurance, so.
I know.
Sorry.
So your point is taken. They don't, probably not. Maybe they need to be insured, like a big old group insurance for that gang, because they look like they've lost their minds with all that crazy stuff they're doing, which is a whole other problem. I don't know how we're going to mitigate that risk in the future, but that is a silent monster sitting over there. At the moment, they're only shooting each other. But what could happen potentially? they could move away from shooting each other to what? It's spooky to say, isn't it? Okay, then let's not say it, but we know. But yes, the thing is, as we get older, we get sicker, and so when you need it the most, you have to pay more to get it, or you can't get it at all, which is an unfortunate tragedy. Because when you're older, you can't really work anymore and to pay your medical bills, and that's when you need it more. You don't need it when you're young. That's the irony of it all. You don't need it most of the times when you're young.
But Mr. There are more young persons now being diagnosed with juvenile diabetes and stuff, and it's so sad because they aren't able to, or I was not able to because I don't work in insurance, but it's hard for them to get insurance, and I think that's kind of sad.
Yes, it is.
Because they're so young.
Yes,
You know?
it is. Which is why, once again, remember that thing that we call national health insurance?
Uh-huh.
Yes. Let me just throw something out for you youngsters of the future will be taking over the Bahamas one day. See that thing called national health insurance? Really, it needs to be improved so that it can protect youngsters like the ones you're talking about and the elderly who have already worked their entire lives building the country in one form or another. See my point? So it's designed to protect the helpless on both sides. In one instance, those who contributed their whole lives to their country in one form or another. Now, does anybody happen to know how many persons are working in the Bahamas at the moment? 150,000? Roughly, anyone? Is that a good rough figure? Is that a good working figure, you think, about 150,000?
No.
How much would you say roughly are working?
Any statistics lately?
Yeah, why don't somebody Google it? Go into Google and type in,
Google it right now.
yeah, the working population in the Bahamas. Anything interesting? What is the estimate?
I see for 2021, the ratio is 59.37.
Of the
As
population?
compared, yeah, as compared to 2019, which is pre-COVID, 65.
Okay, so let's forget about COVID. Eventually, COVID is going to go back to 65. So 65% of the typical 400,000 people, how much is that? We don't know if it's 400,000. We just keep calling it that. What is 65%? How much?
260,000.
Okay, so let's take a conservative number. That's the accountant in me, a conservative number. Let's say 200,000 people are working.
Mm-hmm.
Now, don't put the calculator down. Multiply for me $50 times 200,000 people. How much is that?
That's 10. Wow, 10 million?
10 million.
You sure your calculator is working?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's 10 million.
10 million, right?
Yeah.
10 flicking million. Okay. A month. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's say we pay $50 a month times 200,000 people. So each month we can collect, we meaning the government, 10 million, right? Am I right?
Correct.
10 million times 12 months. How much is that?
120 million.
120 million. Multiply that by 2. How much is that?
240.
So if each person put in $50 a month, we can collect $120 million a year. And if each person put in $100 a month, we can collect $250 million a year. What medical bill that can't pay?
Boy.
Now, see, we keep playing around with it, but go have cookout, kung fritters, let them little children with diabetes dead, and all this foolish talk. When people who are on minimum income are in the gambling houses spending much more than $100 a month, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so we collect a minimum from them, more from the people in the middle, and 5 times more from the people at the top. So we end up with more than 250 million, correct?
Correct.
Why don't we do it? So when Grandma Sue needs a hip replacement, just flick and fix it. When the child needs an operation, just do it. Why wouldn't we do it? Who is that gonna hurt? And we gamble away that more than that on a month. Even poor Bahamians spend more than $100 a month in the gambling house. I wouldn't talk about rich Bahamians who have gazillions of dollars. Right.
That's some food for thought.
That's why I put it out there for you youngsters. It is indeed some food for thought. Don't tell me nobody's going to flick and feel that. I don't care who we are. And we don't have to take 100 from the person on minimum wage. We only need to take 20 from that person. But altogether, it'll be well over $300 million a year. And we're not going to have $300 million in transplants and hip replacements and no flicking year. So you carry it over. So you use 100 million one year, that means you have 200 million left, plus 300 million more is 500 million. True or false?
True. So I have a question.
Yeah, yes.
If we have all of this money circulating, why is it that we are in billions of dollars of deficit?
Pray tell me, because the money is going places, but we don't know where it's going. We only know where they say some is going. Right. That's the whole other problem, separate and apart from the money we could easily get to cover healthcare in this small, flicking place. Okay. Well, Grandpa have to be struggling, but comfort all that stupid talk.
I have an I don't even know how, I guess it's kind of relevant, but let's say, okay, an employer decide to cancel the company's group insurance because the insurance, medical group insurance, the premiums kept going up.
Yes.
So they decided to implement a employee benefit package that contains where it pertains to, like, if an employee gets sick and has to go to the doctor or needs meds, they get once they return or send in their medical receipts or pharmaceutical receipts, they get reimbursed 100%. So the employer they said they're saving money in doing that because not all employees are going to get sick, have major medical expenses, etc. Right? But then NHI came on stream, and then now they're discontinuing that or trying to discontinue that and urge employees to sign up with NHI instead.
Yes.
What's your take on that?
They are obviously looking to transfer the risk to save money, unless somebody steps in to see what the veracity of that is all about with regards to employee benefits. That is a potential problem, obviously. And that is another reason why we need to make national health insurance what it needs to be. those same companies who keep trying to transfer the risk and reduce their costs, let them contribute an equivalent amount of money. They don't want to do it through the employee program to NHI.
Correct.
By law. And the only way you can find yourself out of it if you can prove to the government that you're operating unprofitably. But you have to prove that. And I don't think that they would be able to in most cases. So if you're on minimum wage, you pay a little itsy bitsy. If you earn $500 a week, you pay more. You earn 1,000, you pay more. You earn 5,000, you pay more. You have businesses where you're earning millions and your net profits are millions, you pay gazillions more, so to speak, relatively speaking, within reason. And put it into the fund so that anybody who gets sick, once the doctor signs off and says, this is what needs to be done, just do it. Then nobody has to be worried about this and that and the other bloody thing. How about that? If the rich people don't want to be a part of it, that's fine. They can pay on their own, but they're still going to pay into the fund.
Isn't that how it is for national insurance or similar?
In terms of?
In terms of employers paying, I think a higher percentage compared to the employees.
Yeah, but not high enough. That's why the fund is in trouble now, along with other reasons. But yes, and that's the same thing that can be done with NHI. Those who can afford to pay more, pay more. You're making millions in profits? Why the heck you just paying a little bit above the regular person? Hell no.
Isn't that how they have it in Canada?
The health plan? Yeah, healthcare in Canada is free.
With taxes or something?
Well, of course, you pay the taxes, but
based on your income.
Sorry?
I think that the taxes, it varies. Like if you're a single, if you're married, if you have children, your occupation.
Yeah, it varies. But the point is, they collect significant taxes in places like Canada, but you see the benefit because healthcare is free and education is free. How about that? So yeah, they might take 40% of your income, but that 40%, you don't have to pay for healthcare and you don't have to pay for education. That more than covers it, maybe more.
Exactly.
See my point? So, but that little simple example I showed you that will not take any skin off the poorest Bahamian, true or false? So imagine if we do that on a rotation all the way up to the richest Bahamian. We'll have money rolling over in NHI to pay for any healthcare issues any Bahamian has. On the assumption, of course, that the government does not touch it to do any other government crap. See my point? Which is another issue. All right, just some food for thought for you youngsters of the future. Okay. Yeah, all that came out of health insurance. Then we have liability insurance. We talked about that earlier. Doggone, nobody wants to sue in the Bahamas because they say it's a waste of time. You could hardly find a lawyer who will do it, especially if you're suing other lawyers and doctors and politicians and somebody's something. So this liability insurance is designed to protect professionals in the event that they are sued. Okay? If you have a home and catch fire and burn, going in, these are all liability insurances you can cover. We have these things, okay, to keep our losses to a minimum or certainly controllable so that we don't go down in smoke. Life insurance, we know all about that. The cash benefits to our beneficiaries. Some of them pay annuities as well. They have cash values out there. All of these can help to mitigate risk in the event of our untimely death and we have young children, etc. Annuities, if you're not familiar with that, you put in lump sums of money and it's invested, and every month, based on that lump sum, you'll get a certain amount back every month for life. That is, of course, a mitigator to cash flow problems to help you to minimize your cash flow issues by having additional cash coming in. especially when you retire on a regular basis, similar to national insurance. And of course, let's not forget disability and related insurance. A whole, in fact, it's been said that anything you can think about can be insured. And to some extent, that is true. At one point, they said that Tina Turner had her legs insured. At another point, they said Halle Berry had something on her body insured. Another point, they said that, what's her name, the diva who sings? What's her name? Nobody knows the diva who sings? It's a lot of them, huh? Beyonce had something else insured. So you can insure anything, apparently, okay, in order to mitigate our risk. Marine insurance, we all know what that is, environmental insurance, hopefully political risk. How about that? Political risk insurance can be taken out by a business with operations in countries where there's a risk of revolution. They say African countries are famous for that. I don't know, perhaps other countries are famous for that as well. Because of political unrest, they'll nationalize your business until you get out. Okay, that's called political risk. And so you have political risk insurance even if your company is nationalized and until you get out the country. Africans or Africans get out. So what about my company? Leave the company. You get out. Or else. Political risk insurance. Africa is not the only country that does that. There are other countries in the East that do that. We don't do that too much in the West. What we do in the West instead is change our God-given, let me not go there. Okay. Property insurance, we know what that's all about. Most of us protect the property companies, protect their investment in land and buildings, etc., from fire, theft. We even have what we have insurances to protect companies against theft by employees. Believe it or not, because theft within firms is so rampant, they have a bond type insurance cover that covers employee theft in the event that somebody runs off with any amount of money up to whatever the agreed amount of coverage is. That's interesting. And then even title insurance. Do we have title insurance in the Bahamas, lenders? Do we have title insurance in the Bahamas, lenders? No? Title insurance.
I think we do have that.
We do?
If you buy and if you purchasing property, right?
Oh, I think I know what you said. When you buy property, you get title to the property. You get ownership. Title insurance, on the other hand, is the kind of insurance that you can purchase in other countries to protect that title. Or
yes, some banks require you to take out that
title insurance. Yeah, because sometimes we find that title searches in the Bahamas are not done completely, or lawyers might overlook something, and you end up buying property from a person who doesn't own that property. Sometimes people know they don't own it and still sell it. And if the title search is not done properly, then it could be overlooked. And therefore, you're buying property from somebody who never owned it. And sooner or later, the real owner shows up and says, "This is my property, get off." And he said, "But I already built on it as a carrier building, would get off my property."
That happens a lot.
Unfortunately.
Law firms use professional indemnity insurance for purposes of that nature.
Yeah, in an attempt to mitigate that kind of risk. Okay. If somebody bought the property by mistake and built on it, should they be told to get off? Should they get off?
The unfortunate thing is whoever holds the title or have the recorded conveyance, they are the actual owners. And so that would be an issue that would have to go to court.
Of course. And when it gets to court, should the court rule that the person should get off the property?
I didn't hear. Can you say that again, please?
Let's say it goes to court. Should the court rule generally that the person should get off the property who doesn't own it?
Well, sometimes it comes to an agreement where they would just have to pay them the value of the property, but vacating the property is the first course of action.
Yeah, and in some cases, some people are made to vacate. But I think in terms of equity, if there was an honest mistake, not a dishonest mistake, we don't want equity to be supported by dishonesty. But if there's an honest mistake, the person who built on the property that belongs to somebody else by mistake because they got the buyer title, they should be given the option to purchase the property. I think that should be the typical position of the courts in an honest mistake situation. If the person cannot pay for the property, then we have another problem, Houston, and they may have to vacate it. But they should certainly be given the first option to pay
And
for the property.
unfortunately, the court system cannot give that kind of judgment
Why not?
because, pardon?
Why not?
In matters like that, it is complex and complicated, but it still goes to the archaic laws that we have on the books when it comes to property ownership in the
Correct.
Bahamas.
Correct. But I agree. I agree. But we can change the law and the court can make any ruling it wishes. And so if the court makes a ruling in equity that the person has already built on it, there was an honest mistake, and therefore they should be given the opportunity to buy it, the court could make that ruling if it wants. Doesn't always, but it could.
Yes, it could, but you know why they are cautious with that because they don't want to set precedents. Because once a precedent is set, then it now allows that to be an argument in future cases or a
Indeed.
basis for an argument in future cases.
Indeed. And so certainly we have to consider the equity and the hardship and the precedents. And that's why we believe we have the courts who are supposed to make that decision that should be in the best interest of all concerned. And yes, the person owns the property, but there are see that word again, mitigating circumstances. And of course, by extension, the courts, in addition to making an equity ruling, can go after the person who made the honest mistake, quote unquote, especially the person who made the honest mistake, the law firm, for example, who maybe have a lot of money to pay penalties and so on, and say, you get over here and pay your share of this problem, this, or try or present a case to support to your for your defense in this matter. As you said, there are a lot of issues to consider in those kinds of cases, and they are always messy. All right, and sometimes end up in unfortunate situations where the person who has built on the property has to end up leaving, and or they could sell the building to the person who owns the property. That's another option. If the person says, I don't want your stinking building, then what you do is you just break it down and take your losses. You certainly don't want to leave it to the person who doesn't want to buy it. That's like a gift. You don't want to do that unless you're really feeling generous. But they could have the option to buy it if they so choose. Some people might, others might say, man, I don't want to buy your building. I just want my property because I have my own TP I want to put on it. So you just break it down, take your losses, don't commit suicide, and keep moving. God forbid. All right, it's never a pretty picture, those situations. All right, travel insurance, we all know about that. Does it make sense to buy travel insurance? Anyone? Does it make sense to buy travel insurance?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so planes don't hardly go down though.
It's been beneficial for me.
You're kidding me.
It
You
could
went down in
only
the plane and survived?
Oh, no, I didn't hear that part. I was just saying, in general, travel insurance has been beneficial for
Oh,
me.
you mean for other issues?
Yeah, with unforeseen circumstances coming up and
Oh
being able
yeah,
to
yeah,
um,
that's true.
not have to pay an additional.
Absolutely. Of being able to cancel without penalty.
Right.
Yeah, there are some benefits. That thing about the plane going down, that's not a good idea. Planes normally don't go down.
you
Not
never
too
know.
often.
Go down, your family benefits from it.
Exactly.
They're supposed to.
Yeah, if you go down in the plane, hopefully everybody's not on the plane. Well, even if everybody is, somebody else will get it. Cousins and auntie, think of them. And whatever.
Anybody else?
Yeah. And all the people you hate will get it or something like that. That's funny. Okay. And then workers' compensation insurance. I think we all have an idea what kind of cover that provides, job-related injuries, etc., pay the medical expenses, and so on. Do we have that in the Bahamas, workers' compensation? Well, through NIB, I think to some extent, if you get injured on the job, you can get some NIB
There's,
compensation.
yeah, there's a,
Yeah.
right. NIB provides for that.
Yeah, I don't know if it's enough to cover all kinds of major
Some,
problems.
some employers pay. I can speak for mine. He would pay even when NIB doesn't.
Really?
Yeah.
Man, some people have all the luck. Yeah, yeah. Sometimes you're in an environment where the benefits are better, even than NIB and in some other places. And if you're in that environment, then thank God, because crap happens for sure. Okay? All right. So the risk, as you can see, is never ending. It's all and sundry, and we're constantly looking for ways to mitigate, control, retain, transfer on a personal level and a business level. And if you look at this risk spectrum, these two globes that I have here, one showing the organizational risks, much of which we talked about, and then we see the global risks. One of them is the pandemic. When I did this, there was no pandemic, even in our wildest imagination. But here we are in a pandemic, which is still hanging around. It hasn't gone yet, even though some people are behaving as if it's gone. Many other people are still getting it. China has been locked down for a while in Shanghai, so this thing is still finding around. Climate change is another major issue that's on the agenda. Political fragmentation is on the agenda. Putin says he went into Ukraine because he wants to protect the Russians in East Ukraine. That's interesting. But who can believe what Putin says? And he also says he wants to protect the Russians from Nazism. Imagine that, Nazism, the Hitler syndrome. Imagine that. The things we come up with to invade other people's countries and murder them. How do we mitigate that risk? Sanctions? Is that the mitigation? Sanctions? Is that the answer? Anyone? Is sanctions the answer?
You're recorded, so we can't really say.
Oh. Well, that's true. You guys can't say. But at my age, I'll say anything. Not anything, but you know. I get it. When my children were young, certain things I didn't say either sometimes. But now that they're grown up and blah blah blah, I'll say it. I'll be like, "You see what I mean?" I mean what I say. Anybody bought Hugh Biggerty's book yet? No. Did you know that Hugh Biggity wrote a book?
Yes.
Okay. Say what I mean. I mean what I say. That should be interesting. All right. So that's the spectrum. Believe it or not, all those things we talked about, risk and how to identify it and mitigate it, how to deal with it, how to go around, how to transfer it, how to avoid it, how to reduce it, all that crazy stuff. That's not an exhaustive list of issues. Risks keep changing. Risks keep taking on new faces. And so we have to be constantly on alert in general within our organizations and in general with regards to risk issues. Okay? All right. Let's take a moment to have a little chit chat about that Smith case. Anybody look at the questions at the end? Anybody read it? Anybody had time to look at the Smith case at all? No? Did anybody read the case? They just look at it and say, man, this is just a motel. I don't see any risk there at all.
No, I haven't.
That's okay. When you get a moment, do take a look at the Smith case. And it's not a major issue. It's kind of a business risk, credit risk kind of case. where the little motel is trying to expand and trying to see if it's a good idea to expand and whether or not can get free refinancing from its bank to borrow more money, whether or not they can afford to pay it back, and the kind of credit risk presented to the bank by taking on this tourist-oriented this tourist-oriented motel and so on. So it doesn't have any heavy risk issues. It just has some of the typical ones that we've talked about, and so you should go through and say, what kind of risks are presented in this thing that the Smiths want to do? How can they mitigate that risk? And do they have any other kinds of risks like credit risks, reputation risk as far as the motel? Do they run the risk of losing it if they try to expand, or expanding is the answer? Those kinds of things. That's really what I want you to do when you read the case. So for the few minutes that we have left, what I would like to do is to just introduce you to just some risk conversation. How's that? Nothing in particular, just some risk conversation about a Brazilian company that created a case study from this Brazilian company and how they went about implementing their risk management programs. And I just thought that some of the language was interesting that probably you should hear for a few moments just so that you can have an idea, if you've not had the experience, of the kinds of conversations that come up when we talk about implementing risk management issues. All right, so I'm going to see if I can share the screen. Come on, let's do it. Share screen. What is it? Why is my screen not sharing? Anybody know why my screen is not sharing? Oh, sorry. I think I found it. Share. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I have been blabbering all evening about this, that, and the other thing. And of course, some persons have been blabbering as well. But I need a reader so I can take a break while you enlighten us about some information on this particular company. We're not going to get through the whole thing. It's a pretty involved thing. But I just want to start the conversation so you could hear the language that goes on in major companies around the world with regards to the implementation of risk management issues. So, do I have any volunteers?
I'll do it.
Okay, that sounds good. Who said that?
Kayleen.
Okay, Kayleen, excellent. Thank you very much. If you go up to the left-hand corner where they have Company A, the implementation of risk management, just start reading at that point, and I
The company's risk management system was implemented in 2005 during the selection of a consultancy firm as part of the formalization of the risk analysis process. Some specific areas in the company already had a risk identification and handling system, although there was no standardized structure and methodology. Demand for the structuring of a risk management system came from the holding company and majority shareholder. It was determined that two subsidiaries were to develop a common system that could it seems as if
What's happening? I can't see anything.
No, it seems as if his fell off.
Yeah, it's not on anymore.
So he's not on
My
anymore.
current just went off, so I don't know if like BBL just knocking everybody out. My current just went off.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm in Freeport.
Lucky you.
So am I, Colleen.
Oh, that's Shakira?
I'm in
Maud.
no.
Oh,
I'm
Maud.
Yeah.
Where are
I
you?
just came over this afternoon though.
Oh,
Flight.
I thought you were meaning you were living here.
No, I'm here
You're just
tonight.
visiting. Okay.
No, I am from here, so I'm visiting my mom and my sister.
Oh, okay. Okay. You're Smith from where? West End?
Yes, ma'am.
Trying to figure out who would be your family. I have family down there too.
I also do.
Yeah.
The Wilchcombs, yeah.
So we'd be related, Shakira.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you know Josephine Wilchcomb? I mean, she's not living now, but that's Obi's grandmother.
Yes.
Okay,
Obi
so
is my dad's first cousin.
oh, okay, so close family. So and Joe and my grandmother were sisters.
Oh, wow. Small world.
Small world, yeah. My grandmother was a Smith.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. I'll let my dad know.
Mhm.
He gets
Who's your
excited
father?
when he hear Eric Wilchcomb.
Oh, okay. I don't know them per se, but I just like to get the name so that when I hear my family talk about it, I could say, okay, I know who that is.
Did you know Yvonne, who had a restaurant? She died though in West End a few years back.
No, I didn't
I
know
don't
her.
remember the name of the restaurant though, but it got damaged from that hurricane that oh Lord.
Matthew.
Yes, Hurricane Matthew.
Because that's when West End got
Really
damaged
damaged. Yeah.
in 2016. Yeah.
Wow. I think the bars are from there as well, eh?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So
I guess
everyone
yeah, everybody is falling off. So I
thank
think
God
that's
I'm
it.
in Nassau this weekend.
I guess
Wow.
that's it for us then.
So do y'all know if anyone, I don't know, do y'all know we have class next week? Because I know we weren't supposed to
We
have
were
class
supposed to
today.
have class this week. We were supposed to have it next week. I only came on because I saw the email.
So you think they're gonna resume class next week into the new module or maybe we need to ask.
Probably.
Oh, okay.
Probably.
Yeah. I can find out from Miguel and I can have him send us all an email.
Yeah, that would be good.
Okay.
Ernst just jumped back on. I think we should call it
Yeah, because
call
nobody
it a
knows
night.
how long that can take to come back on.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
Okay then.
You all have a happy
Everyone have
Easter.
a same to everyone.
Stay safe.
Good evening,
y'all
Have a
everyone.
good night.
Evening. Well, take care.
talk to y'all next
Bye
Okay.
bye.
Bye.
week. Bye.